how the project started. And basically the focus was kind of on like, how are people doing as they're resettling in the Netherlands? What's their well-being like? What are their hardships, but what are also good things that are happening?
Yeah.
That comes from many perspectives, including a personality perspective. So personality perspective would be like, what's going on with the whole person versus like narrowing in on like a symptom or something like that. So in a way, it was pretty broad. To sum it up, it was like, how are people growing in their personality when we think about positive personality traits?
Right. Hi, welcome to the Karakter Podcast. My name is Andre Ardona. I'm a fourth-year University of Toronto Mississauga student. I'm double majoring in psychology and sociology. I'm making this podcast as a part of a UTM course called Knowledge Translation. In this class, students seek to clearly and effectively communicate discoveries from UTM's psychology department. This is the first installment of a two-part series where I speak with Professor Joanne Chung. Dr. Chung worked with Dr. Odelia Lacalia of Utrecht University on the Karakter Project as the study's principal investigators. Quoting from the study's website, the Karakter Project is a developmental research study focused on the emotions and character growth of Syrian-origin young adults who had recently resettled in the Netherlands. In this episode, we introduced Dr. Chung and her research. We also discussed what the Karakter Project is, what work went into starting up the study, and the project's main findings. If you are interested in hearing our conversation on how to enrich the research process, I invite you to listen to the second part of this podcast. Thank you for coming.
I am currently in my fifth year of being an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at UTM, and I am a personality psychologist. The short way of explaining what that kind of area of psychology is just kind of focusing more on what makes people different and unique, why they are the way they are, and things like that. So I've been in the field since I think officially 2007. So it's been a while. I would say that my interest in personality psychology was always there, but my origin story is in cross-cultural psychology, where I started in a lab in San Francisco examining nonverbal expressions of emotion across cultures. I would say at UTM, I am very interested in focusing on personality development in young adulthood. Andre, you probably have taken a developmental psychology class. And when we think about developmental psychology, what comes to mind?
It was a while since I took it, and
Yeah.
it was online, so
Yeah.
the
But
quality
like,
of
what's
what I really
the
got was
population of, right?
Yeah,
Like, what do
right.
you usually think about when you think
always
of
children.
children,
Always children.
babies, right? What I'm interested in is like still developmental psychology, but focused on a specific period. So more on like the adolescent period and the emerging adulthood period, which is a kind of a newly coined term, typically between the ages of 18 and 25, maybe 29 now, maybe even longer. This developmental stage only is supposed to be in cultures where we're able to push off adult responsibilities. Right. Emerging adulthood is like the in-between period between like adolescence, when you're leaving high school and then you're going to maybe university, or you're getting your first job, you're in your first serious romantic relationship, etc. And you're able to kind of explore and things like that. And I really like that period because I'm a big fan of identity, which is a layer of personality. I realized in my own field in personality psychology, this is about like describing individual differences and people's patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. There's very little about folks specifically that are from minoritized groups. And
Yeah.
I was like, that seems like kind of like an easy gap to fill. And
Right.
also from my experience as like a Korean American, I'm personally interested. And so here at UTM, I'm actually getting ready to start a project called Giving Voice. And it is a longitudinal study of a cohort of incoming first-year students, and it's meant to follow them over the course of their university studies.
So it's a perfect segue for what I want to talk about next, because one of the big personality psychology projects that you worked on is the Karakter Project, and it involves personality change. A large sample, or a large part of the sample, was emerging adults, and it's also longitudinal. Can you elaborate more for the audience exactly what the project entails and what it is?
Yeah, so this project is called the Karakter Project, and my Dutch, it's niet zo goed, but it is Karakter. It's been a while since we conducted the study, so I have reflected a lot about it. But basically, it was like the brainchild of myself and a researcher named Odulia Lakalia, and she's currently at Utrecht University. But at the time, we were both early assistant professors at Tilburg University. So, like I said, I was in the south of the Netherlands. And, when you're really like fresh out of grad school and you're getting your footing, you have these opportunities to kind of change directions. So I had left grad school having done a dissertation on self-esteem development during the university years, but I had always analyzed data that had already been collected by people. And the same thing with my friend Odulia. And we were in the canteen, which is just the way that we refer to cafeteria in Tilburg. And we were just eating these like cheese sandwiches. And I think we were like looking to create a project that was very collaborative. So we were like, okay, well, let's look for funding opportunities, because in the Netherlands, it's hard to collect data unless you have like a grant. And we had just found out that the Templeton Foundation, which is in the States, actually put a call out for funding applications on the study of character and character development. So from a personality lens, character is part of personality. These are things that are focused on like your virtues, your values, positive like traits, right? Like, so for an illustration, like one of the things that I really like as an emotions researcher is compassion and gratitude as a trait, right? And my friend Odelia was really interested in post-traumatic growth. She had a background in studying psychopathology in children and adolescents, and we both really cared about longitudinal change. And so we were like, why don't we pursue this? At the time, we were really naive because we were like, we never really collected our own data before. What's a problem? What's a social problem? Or like something that's happening in society, in the Dutch society right now, that we can kind of investigate. And one thing that we were noticing is that there's like a large influx of people that were seeking refuge in the Netherlands. And one of the largest groups of folks were Syrian people because, right, like it was 2016, so it was near like the Arab Spring, right? Like people were like had to flee. And so naively, because like I'm a Korean American, right? Like I'm just like, right, I'm an American person. Odelia is super Dutch, and we're like, why don't we do a longitudinal study on character change in Syrian youth that have just kind of come to the Netherlands and are resettling? And I think we had really good intentions, but we looked at the literature and we were like, hey, like a lot of the literature is focused on immediate needs. And that's totally fair because people that are seeking refuge need to find physical shelter, have safety, eat. But we were like, if we get funding, we can at least track for a year, which is not that long, but it's not just a cross-sectional snapshot. And we could get a sense of how people are actually, like, how are things going for them for a longer period of time. So that's how the project started. And basically the focus was kind of on like, how are people doing as they're resettling in the Netherlands? What's their well-being like? What are their hardships, but what are also good things that are happening? Yeah. That comes from many perspectives, including a personality perspective. So personality perspective would be like, what's going on with the whole person versus like narrowing in on like a symptom or something like that. So in a way, it was pretty broad. To sum it up, it was like, how are people growing in their personality when we think about positive personality traits?
Right. Mm-hmm. And so moving on then to the results, what were the main findings that you would want to communicate to the audience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's so interesting because I think this speaks to the tension of trying to do meaningful research and then collecting a lot of it. And then everyone is going through a transition themselves. So like we're still analyzing some of the data. One of the main questions by the funders was based on a quote that's attributed to Nietzsche. It's like, what doesn't kill you, does it make you stronger? And one way to do that for us was to look at previous experiences of adversity and then track well-being and like those positive personality traits over time. And what we see is that there's no normative trajectory. You can run these like models of how people are changing on certain traits, and you can see if a lot of people are moving in the same direction. And we don't see that. So that totally makes sense to me because also it's limited because it's not like we had a tight experimental control group or anything where we were like, okay, now you leave Syria at this time. Like that would be really weird, right?
Yeah, right.
So it's very like observational. People differed in the amount of time they had been in the Netherlands. But in general, what we see is that like from the measures we had in our study, we don't see like normative change. When I say normative, it doesn't mean it's not a value that I'm placing on it. It's just like statistically normative. There's not a bunch of people moving in the same direction.
Right.
There are different ways that people change. And I think that totally makes sense. So in addition to that, like we find things that are really important, like post-migration stressors to be related to well-being. That makes sense because it's like, you know, if you're not feeling like financially secure, if you're feeling like you're not integrating well, those are all factors that matter for how good you're doing and how satisfied you are with your life.
On that same topic of normative change, something that you talked about in one of your articles was dispositional compassion. Can you speak more on what that is?
So dispositional compassion, and this is like anytime that like, at least when I talk about dispositions, it's kind of like a narrower version of like, you've probably heard of the Big Five, right? Little lesson here is that the Big Five is a descriptive kind of taxonomy encompassing like nearly all individual differences. And they're pretty broad, you know, things like openness to experience, extroversion, etc. They're broad dimensions. And when we talk about dispositions, the way that I think about them mentally is that like the Big Five are like is like a huge umbrella, and then these traits like dispositional compassion, like I conceptually think about it as related to agreeableness, because agreeableness is about being warm and communal. And so, but compassion is more specific. Compassionate means that when you see somebody suffering, right, you relate to them like you're meeting as people on the same level. Like I'm a human, you're suffering. I have this urge to help you. That's compassion as an emotion. On a dispositional level, we think that there are certain people that just on average, they have a tendency towards compassion. Somebody who's really high in dispositional compassion, we might be like, wow, they really don't need that much to feel it. So there's like a lower threshold. They might feel it for longer. They might feel it more intensely. We use an analysis. We call it like a person-centered approach versus a variable-centered approach. And what that just means is that we're able to place somebody into a type. So here, because it's longitudinal, we're able to say like people are in this category, they're increasing in their compassion over the year. Or these people that are like showing no change, they're in a category of that sort of trajectory. But yeah, so our findings just showed that like there's no common path. There are about 4 groups. I think you can hear the hesitance in my voice because while I appreciate that we did what we could with the data that we have, because I just want to say like we had 168 people participate. And usually in these types of studies, we would like to have more people, but given our sample, and I think it was actually really, really cool to have that many folks participate, but that also limits kind of what you can do quantitatively with those data. So I want to just put a little bit of caveat there too, that this type of analysis, it nearly always, like I make jokes with people because I'm just like, this type of analysis nearly always creates 3 or 4 groups where like people are either increasing, decreasing, staying the same, or like not showing, you know what I mean? So I mean, it was still really informative to I think the underlying message is that there's no one way of doing it. I think what's hard with these types of traits too, these very positive, socially desirable traits maybe, is that in general you get something called like a ceiling effect. So it's hard to kind of get that variability.
So on the ceiling effect, actually, I thought it was really interesting because when I was reading the paper, generally I think your sample had high levels of dispositional compassion coming into it, and then you saw decreases over time. On that note, can you speak more about why you think the dispositional compassion was so high to begin with, and then what that ceiling effect is for the listeners who may not be familiar with that terminology?
Usually psychologists, like we're curious about stuff that you can't see or touch, like happiness, life satisfaction, compassion. You can't really quantify those things as directly as, let's say, your height or your weight. And so we call these psychological constructs. And we should go into it assuming that they're going to be measured imperfectly. So this is what we do. We administer a questionnaire, typically. Some people argue that self-reports aren't that great, but there are also people, and I agree, I think I take this perspective too generally. It's like, I'm like, if I want to know about you, like I'm going to ask you how you're doing. Like that seems pretty reasonable. So with this questionnaire and other questionnaires we gave, you usually give like a series of statements to folks and you have them like place themselves on a rating scale. And usually it's like a Likert-like scale that goes from like something like strongly disagree to strongly agree. And you just have people kind of endorse stuff. And so for the dispositional compassion scale, most folks were like strongly endorsing, yes. And I'm just really paraphrasing here. I am a compassionate person. You know, I tend to really want to help people when they're in need. And that's not saying that it doesn't reflect real stuff. It's just that when you start with a measurement that's very, very high on average, there's little room for it to get higher. So that's what we mean when we say ceiling effect.
So they started off high and then you had that ceiling effect where like it's so high to the point where you can't really go much higher usually. Why do you think it was so high in the first place?
It could be like something as dry as like a response style, like or a response bias. At the same time, like we also collected various types of data in this project, which is really, really cool. Like one of the things that we're still working on is like listening to audio recordings of people's daily life. Like that is so amazing. And then we also collected narratives, which is they were written. It was an open-ended kind of their own story about their journey between leaving Syria and coming to the Netherlands. What we noticed in their stories is how different they were. There were some people that were like, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. And it was pretty easy. And others that were like, they went through a lot of hardship. And the way they tell the story kind of shows that they've done a lot of reflection about it. And it's kind of placed them on a life course that does make them want to help others. So do you know what I mean? So I feel like despite like just having those caveats around, well, you know, the measurement was restricted because most people were kind of scoring above average. It does make sense to me, like after also meeting some of the participants, because I did do some of the data collection appointments as well, and that was really, really fun. Just like folks have been through a lot, like to get to the Netherlands. And I guess what I'm trying to say, to draw a connection between is that maybe the folks that have experienced those really intense hardships, because they know what it's like, they have deep empathy, and therefore that allows them to have compassion for others who are in need.
Researchers from the Karakter Project suggest that there is no normative trajectory in the personality developments of the people they studied. The experiences of Syrian origin young adults who recently resettled in the Netherlands are diverse. While immigrating to a new country is easy for some, for others it proved to be an arduous and challenging process. One personality trait that Karakter researchers focused on was dispositional compassion. Dispositional compassion describes an individual's tendency to feel concern for others' suffering and a desire to alleviate the suffering. Researchers observed that the average levels of dispositional compassion among participants were high at the start of the study. Dr. Chung suggests that response biases may have influenced the subjects' responses. Response bias occurs when people respond to questions or surveys inaccurately or in manners that don't truly reflect their thoughts. There are various response biases, including social desirability bias, where participants answer in ways that conform to societal norms of acceptability or desirability. Dr. Chung also states that high levels of dispositional compassion may be linked to personal struggle. Some participants may have felt inspired to help others as a result of the hardships they endured while immigrating to the Netherlands. The Karakter team made it a priority to enrich the research process. Dr. Chung describes turning points in the study that were brought about by introspection and extensive collaboration with her colleagues. A wealth of developments subsequently flourished, including participant enrichment. If you would like to learn more, I welcome you to tune in to our next episode. Thank you for listening. The data collected from the Karakter Project is still being analyzed. If you would like to keep track with updates, visit karakterproject.nl. That is KARAKTER project.nl.